time. And now let me invite Wojciech Niebrzydowski, who will talk
Bardzo dziękuję za umożliwienie przeprowadzenia swojej prezentacji.
Thank you so much for allowing me to take floor among such distinguished guest participants. So again, I'll be talking about residential architecture, perhaps the most monumental part of it. So monumentalization of architecture in the second half of the 20th century. According to the dictionary, monumentality means magnificence, grandeur, and durability. For centuries, the quality of monumentality was attributed to buildings with prestigious functions such as temples, theaters, libraries. However, in the 20th century, riding the wave of humanism, the importance of residential building increased. The everyday lives of people concentrated in such buildings became a determinant of creative activities and acquired a symbolic status. This work aims to present and characterize the phenomenon of monumentalization of residential architecture in the second half of the 20th century. I based my research on analyzing some selected multi-family residential buildings representing various architectural trends in different countries. But I based my work on the characterization of the concept of monumentality in architecture as presented in the manifesto 9 Points on Monumentality, published in 1943 by Joseph Le Cerf, Jean Leger, and Siegfried de Dion. And I also referred to some challenging statements by Leon Krier on the theory of modernism as presented in his publications from the last quarter of the 20th century. No doubt the monumental architecture was going through a crisis in the early 20th century. Joseph Arnold announced death of monuments, and he claimed that contemporary buildings aspiring to the title of monumental ones demonstrated a fascination with the past rather than the new values. The authors of Manifesto 9 Points on Monumentality largely agreed with Mumford's theses. Cerf, Leger, and Gideon announced it in 1943 during World War II, and they predicted that the post-World world would foster profound and radical changes in architecture and urban planning. They consider the creation of monuments in architecture to be one of the most important tasks of modern architecture after the war. The first 2 points of the manifesto essentially contributed to the basis for the definition of monumentality in architecture. They read as follows: monument were human landmarks which men have created as symbols for their ideas, and they are intended to outlive the period that originated them and constitute a heritage for the future generations as such that form the link between the past and the future. Then monuments are the expression of men's highest cultural needs. They have to satisfy the eternal demand of people for translation of their collective force into symbols. The most vital monuments are those that express the feelings and thinking of its collective force, the people. The authors of the manifesto then emphasized the symbolic significance of monuments. They were intended to reflect the aspirations of societies and build a moral and cultural identity. They believed that only the epoch that would create that unifying culture was capable of creating a monument. They saw that potential in the coming period. They demanded that fast developing cities should have their urban planning activities correlated and harmonized with other activities. The principles contained in the 9 points on monumentality had certainly a significant impact on the development of post-war architecture and urban planning. It was only postmodernist ideas that led to the undermining of some of them. Leon Krier, who represented the conservative wing of postmodernism, argued that only certain functions of buildings predisposed them to monumentality. And here he did not include the residential function to such functions. He emphasized the only building types that have developed throughout the years evolved, quote, until they have reached their proper, that is, logical and rational form, unquote, can have a symbolic meaning. He wrote that for traditional cultures, imitation is a way of producing objects that were unique yet similar. He contrasted them with modernist cultures in which invention, innovation, and discovery were the utmost goal and primary goal. So let me now present several examples to support my thesis. As Sartre, Leger, and Gideon predicted, after World War II, changes in the organization of community life in the city followed. In rapidly developing countries, comfortable living in an impressive buildings became a social idea in a work of architectural genius, and that was reflected in residential buildings that could be attributed with the features of architectural monuments. It is clear that they represented a small part of all residential buildings, but their existence became a real cultural need to people. The first post-war residential building characterized by monumentality could be Unité d'habitation in Marseille, designed by Le Corbusier. It was full of emotions, and that concept was rooted in its strong form and sizes. So its height 56 meters and length 165 meters made the building domineering over its surroundings. And then now, when equally large structures were erected in the area, the impact of the size diminished. However, the impact of the material is continuous. So, concrete is exposed in all elements of the building, and it was treated as a natural material without any meticulous processing, leaving all the textural defects visible. So the Le Corbusier also intended to be a reference to monumental historical architecture, creating a link between the post-war era and the past. Le Corbusier wrote, "Have you never noticed that the stones in the walls of cathedrals and palaces are irregular and crooked, and mistakes have been left out or even emphasized? Perhaps you don't notice these things when you look at architecture." Large dimensions of buildings undoubtedly play a role in creating a sense of monumentality. And here we have this particular significance of vertical orientation, which also carries symbolic meaning. Well, these are characteristic features of skyscrapers growing massively after World War II. So let me give you just some examples, like Mesa van der Rohe in Chicago, monumental high-rise buildings in Chicago. So undoubtedly that reflected the spirit of contemporary America. Rectangular shapes of the building, the rectangular divisions of the glass facades. However, due to the spread of this type of aesthetics, they quickly became trivialized. A significant portion of the US society back then expected more expressive forms with more individual nature. And that was responded to by Frank Lloyd Wright, a US architect who built this Price Tower in 1955. The Price Tower soon became the symbol and the landmark of that small town of Bathersville in Oklahoma. So that building was building, as we may guess, on diagonal plan, and we have that twisted plane, and the facade also features a rich array of details. So that was one of the high-rise buildings in this urban landscape. And similarly to Dean, well, let me walk in his footsteps in London. So then it's Keeling House in London, low-rise brick building. So again, London was experimenting with internal structure of habitable high-rise buildings. So Dennis Lasdom called his type of high-rise building the cluster block. The most famous structure of this type that exists until now in London is located in Bethnal Green district. That's the Keeling House, which consists of the main circulation core, which you cannot really see on this picture because we have three diagonally oriented wings, and then we have other high-rise buildings built in 1960s, at the early 1970s, but these are Bathroom Tower and Trillic Tower. They refer to the epoch of brutalism that left a profound mark on the British capital. In the last 20 years of the 20th century, other buildings were erected, like this building in Malmö that was supposed to have several aspects and meanings. So this symbol was to transform Malmö's western harbor. It was to signify the rapid development of the city and the country. And it was to symbolize the unity of all Scandinavia as it was located near the modern Öresund Bridge. So the question is whether vertical orientation and significant height are essential to being considered a monument. According to Creer, there is this vertical skyscraper and horizontal earth scraper category. Well, so this is a sarcastic statement, but you may claim that there are some architectural monuments with the horizontal orientation, like for example Pedro Cuyo Estate in Rio de Janeiro, which is a long horizontal residential buildings towering among other block buildings in that area because it is located on the top of a hill. The formal strength of the structure comes from its shape, which resembles a ribbon winding in accordance with the topography of the terrain. Although Creer criticized the pursuit of discovery and innovation, for much of the 20th century it was in fact one of the humanity's most important collective goals. Therefore, architectural work inspired by this pursuit often became monuments. Many avant-garde architectural ideas remain solely in that design phase, so that, for example, also applies to the Japanese metabolism. So we have this full invention and modern nation's presentation and picture. Then we have that Kagin Capsule Tower in Tokyo. It was one of the best examples of such metabolist monument. The building does not exist. Then we have Habitat 67 in Montreal. That was the result of an unfinished experiment. Moshe Safdie designed a structure that combined architectural and urban scale, consistent with the message of 9 points of monumentality. So no compromise urge to achieve innovation. Well, that was connected with the beginnings of postmodernism. In a way, it was a response to the need to return to the plural aspect of naturalism. So architects were planning that return to human scale, but it doesn't mean that the idea of monumental residential houses was completely abandoned. In the early 1980s, 2 housing complexes that demonstrated that were built in outskirts in Paris, in Espace d'Abraxas, designed by Ricardo Bofill. The accumulation of references to ancient architecture is overwhelming. And not far from that location, we have Arenes de Picasso complex designed by Manuel Núñez Janowski. The precast concrete elements used in its construction, like the buildings themselves, have unusual shapes, and their historical style shaped and influenced structures are now hardly recognizable. Then we have trends of the late 20th century constructivism, and here we have two pioneers and chief representatives of these trends. And then we have another residential complex, Neue Zollhof in Düsseldorf, completed in 1998 by Frank Gehry. Then we have another Viaduct Housing Hospital in Vienna. So this one was erected above the state-of-the-art model train flybridge, and we have the certain position and planning style. The whole plan resembles Zaha Hadid. So on the basis of available plans on residential architecture from 1942 to the year 2000, monumental buildings can be found in all trends and tendencies. They have a lot in common, so they are of a large size, their form is oriented, but also horizontal or diagonal levels are also possible. They are very well exposed in space, so it would be usually a standalone building, expressive, strong forms, based on the character, and repeatability undermine that unique nature of the works. Thank you.